Well, we went to 15 places up and down the country. We were very well received. Lots of people were very enthusiastic to tell us their story. It wasn't just councils, it was councils and health services and voluntary sector and DWP and the police and all sorts of places. And in most of the places, we found some version of transformation happening. In no place did we find transformation happening across the waterfront of local services. It was quite patchy, it was quite selective. We found everybody was keen to tell us that what they were doing was first and best, and we found that it was unusual to get people to say, we're doing this differently because we saw that someone down the road had already spent some development time on this and we just learnt how to do it from them. And we felt that actually when we're really on our game as a country, we will have that sort of knowledge exchange and that trust between areas so that people don't have to innovate alone. Well, we do think that this emphasis on being thoughtful about those people who've got complex needs, or sometimes called high demand, those households who, one way or another, take a slightly larger slice of the public sector pie than others. We think those are the people who both deserve a joined up approach, but also it's in everybody's interests that we move those positions to be move those households to a position where they are less demanding, more independent, more self-sufficient, and so on. So we think however you analyse this, you come back to where are we spending the money and how can we spend that money more smartly. Because there's a separate strand of work which we also looked at, which is what can we do to stimulate growth locally, and we still think there's more fruit in shaking the tree of public assets locally. One of the complexities is that they're owned in a very complex pattern. Some of them appear on the national balance sheets of the NHS, for example. Some of them are owned by foundation trusts. Some of them are owned by local councils, and so on and so forth. And we'd like to move to a position where there's a rebuttable assumption that if something is being operated locally, then its use should be rationalised locally, and the benefits of that rationalisation should be available to use locally, because we think that's putting the incentives in the system where they need to be. We certainly wanted to have an overt investment in leadership training, so training people together. I think it's a bit of a shame. It's very common for professions to train alone, to conference alone, to read their own journals. And while that's understandable, actually none of that reinforces this sense that we need to find ways of working across skills, across organisations. So we wanted some overt commitment to that, and I think the government will come up with that. Albeit on a low-cost model. We wanted a what works centre for transformation alongside the other what works centres, so that they could validate people who'd proved that there was a different way of doing things, and that will give people confidence to say there's a lower cost version of a benefits service or an environmental health service or a way of getting people out of hospital, and actually we all ought to do it the Peterborough way or the Essex way or the Somerset way. And at the moment, we're not quite there yet. People don't really necessarily feel that they've got the confidence to adapt somebody else's model wholesale. Well, I think you do that because you do it from the bottom up rather than the top down. I think if you say, we have decided that X and Y will need to work together, then A, B, C and D probably just look on and say, well, this has nothing to do with us. Whereas actually, if you get the right people around the table locally and say, what are we going to do about persistent offenders, or what are we going to do about people who've been to A&Es 8 times this month, because both of those things are costing their neighbours large amounts of money and probably not actually giving them very sensible, rewarding lives, then I think you have that local creativity, and they say, well, hang on, isn't there a housing dimension to this? Or what about if the library service could do something? Or what about the voluntary sector? So I think having the tent locally and making it the big tent locally, rather than just saying, actually, we're going to have a slightly bigger tent and we're going to put these NHS functions and this local council function in it and leave them to get on with it, is a much richer and more purposeful way of proceeding. Well, we did think that you have to oil the wheels of change. And one of our recommendations was that local councils, who are normally the biggest part of a local service network, should be able to borrow to fund the cost of change. That would require some relaxation of the current rules, where you can potentially borrow, providing you can pay that money back from a new income stream, but paying it back from a savings stream takes a maturation of that expectation, which we think is perfectly sensible. And we wait to see whether the government, probably the next government, will bite on that. Well, we have started, we're 3 weeks in, and no one, not in Rotherham or outside, doubts that the council should have been better equipped and more focused on meeting the needs of young women at risk and those who were traumatised by those criminal actions by others. So we want to make sure that we go from the best of those, from the worst of those services to the best of those services. But also the inference was that that sort of serious failure doesn't happen in a council that's doing everything right. Rather, there are lots of other things that would benefit from remedial work. There's a whole new cohort, a new generation of councillors arriving in elections this year and probably next. We want to help them to make sure they're well equipped to take back those democratic leadership and accountabilities as soon as it's responsible to do so.